to switch gears here and talk about the way that the atheist community talks about religion. The atheist/science community talks about religion in the mainstream press, because this is a conversation that seems to go on endlessly, and to which there is no good answer. I have never seen an atheist and a believer have rhetorical combat and then one of them just put down their sword and go, you know what, you're right, I don't believe in God, or Jesus is Lord. The two sides are just so entrenched, and they go at it seemingly endlessly. So the question is, what do the new atheists and the people I'm talking about in the groups I'm talking about, what is it that they misunderstand about the way religious thought and theology and Christian philosophy works? What is it that they're not getting?
I think one of the things that they're missing out is how self-critical we actually are. How many years did you go to school to become a theologian? You probably don't even want to tell us. Could I list all of the major intellectual crises that the Christian tradition has faced over its history? You bet I can. Do I see them as very severe intellectual problems? You bet I do. And so to think that religious people are highly gullible, they simply haven't learned as much about the history of our own self-criticism as those of us who study Christianity and related religions have. But the one thing that they are getting partly right, and that we really have to listen to, is the extent to which religions have been implicated in violence. And so here is, you might say, an intellectual crisis that they are rightly bringing to us. We have to ask ourselves, what have we been doing wrong over the centuries that the new atheists can be on target, not always, but in many cases, in accusing Christians and other religionists of participating in evil?
John?
Yes, I think the one level of discussion is the moral issue. The problem with that is always inconclusive, because no matter what side you're on, you're always going to think of a new item to add to your list of reasons for rejecting or accepting theistic views. As an academic, my approach has been to ask whether they're intellectually respectable. What are the intellectual foundations of the new atheism? And they're very clear. In fact, they're self-avowed. They would acknowledge this themselves. The first item is what we call scientism, and it's a term that Richard Dawkins, for example, accepts. It's the belief that science is really the only reliable road to gathering truth about the real world. From that follows scientific naturalism, which is the view that reality consists only of that which is, in principle, available to scientific experience and ordinary experience. What they have added, which makes it interesting to me as somebody interested in evolution, is a third item, which you might call evolutionary naturalism, and that's that evolutionary biology now provides sufficient reason for why we are moral, intellectual, as well as religious. And now that we have a purely empirical explanation for these things, then why do we need theology? And my reply is something like what I said earlier. I can go into it in great detail, but it's to try to get us to think in terms of layers of explanation. I'm not competing. For example, religion, yes, at one level, religion. We are religious because religion has been adaptive. It's helped our genes get on from one generation to the next, yes. But even from a secular point of view, you could also add we are religious because it gives us a sense of community and happiness and so forth. But you could also add, at least in principle, without contradicting the scientific levels of explanation, that we are religious because we have been addressed by the infinite. And I would say that the milieu, from a theological point of view, the whole universe, the whole evolving universe, is infinite being, infinite truth, infinite goodness, infinite love. And this has always exercised an attractive force or causality, if you will, on the whole cosmic process, so that when humans come along in the process, we respond consciously, yes. And that's what soul means to me. Soul, I like the word soul. And soul is that space within us which responds to the mystery of being, the goodness that pervades everything, the unity, the coherence, the meaning, the truth, the beauty. These are what philosophers and theologians traditionally call the transcendentals. They all belong together. So at one level, yes, religion, you can tell the evolutionary story of how morality, mind, religion came along, and I want to push those explanations as far as possible. But you could also say, in general, the whole process is a response and not just pushed from behind by mechanical causation.
What I think an awful lot of the new atheists get wrong, and I admire their writing. I admire the challenges they put to religion. I don't think, I tell every Christian I know, unless you can read The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins and come away still a Christian, you haven't confirmed your faith. I mean, this is important stuff to read these challenges. I think Sam Harris carries out a similar service. I was very pleased a couple years ago to debate Christopher Hitchens in print and go back and forth on the issue of whether or not science has made the concept, modern science has made the concept of God obsolete. And I think Mr. Hitchens and I had an interesting exchange of views, which is still available on the web, and I enjoyed it a great deal. To me, the stereotype of religion and religious faith as being the enemy of science, first of all, displays a kind of historical ignorance of the roots of Western science, which actually come from the whole tradition of Western monotheism, which basically views man as being separate from nature and therefore gives you a kind of objective platform from which to study that nature. And that objective platform basically is what we try always imperfectly to replicate in science.
Theology was a science.
The Western view of the relationship between man and nature leads directly to the emergence of Western science, upon which the new atheists claim to base much of their critique. That's one thing. The other thing is the notion that that religious faith is inalterably opposed to science because it involves accepting dogma without evidence, which is what I often hear sometimes, is, first of all, flies in the face of the kind of humility that I think truly religious people do show with respect to great questions. But the other thing is the sort of personal judgments it leads us to make. And the example, and we were talking about this before we came on stage, is about a year and a half ago, President Obama nominated Francis Collins, a very distinguished geneticist, to head the National Institutes of Health. Sam Harris wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times, rather arguing with some passion the following line of argument, which is Francis Collins is a Christian. Christians believe a lot of stupid things. No one who believes a lot of stupid things should be allowed to run the NIH. And that was the essence of the argument. The reality is that Francis, although he's an evangelical Christian, is an extraordinary scientist who brought in the Human Genome Project 2 years ahead of schedule and about $150 million under budget. And the reality of that is he has proven to be an extraordinarily capable administrator of the National Institutes of Health. About 40% of the members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the group to which pretty much all practicing scientists belong in the United States, profess some sort of belief in a supreme being. And that in itself argues simply in terms of demographics that the notion of religious faith being fundamentally antithetical to the scientific enterprise is simply wrong.
Right. Except that Sam has, I agree with you about Francis Collins, and I also wrote a piece supporting Francis Collins. I don't think that one's religious beliefs should be a litmus test for a position as the head of a federal...
Not the least of which is because the Constitution says that.
That's right. On the other hand, some staggering number of Americans don't believe in evolution right now.
Of course.
50, something like 50%, and as you well know, and they are not believing in evolution in the name of their religious faith.
For the most part, that's true.
So Sam's argument that they are waving the flag of ignorance or anti-science is not wrong. And are you saying that they're not true Christians?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying they're wrong about science. And the reality is, it's absolutely true that the principal obstacle towards acceptance of the theory of evolution, you certainly see this in public education. These are battles I've been involved in for 2 decades now. Certainly is a kind of fundamentalist belief that the Bible should be read as a book of science and not just a book of spiritual revelation. And that's something that I actually think the early Christians, and I put Augustine in this category, and a little bit later I put Aquinas in this category, they would not have understood. They would not have understood this kind of reading.
Yeah.
The kind of modern fundamentalism that we see, that regards the Bible as scientifically authentic, had to wait for science to develop. And it turns out it's not a traditional belief. It's something that took hold in the United States in the 1870s and 1880s. So it's really a recent development. That's why I don't equate it with what I would regard as traditional Western monotheism.
Yes, if you read the New Atheists, read Sam Harris's letter to the Christian nation, for example, you'll see in him, but you also see it in Hitchens and Dawkins and others. And that's the fact that they share with their creationist and intelligent design adversaries an assumption that somehow if religious literature is to have anything which would make us pay attention to it, it should be giving us reliable scientific information. And that's the exact same assumption the creationist has. The creationist looks at Genesis and sees a story of origins and places that in contact with or juxtaposition with Darwin's, said, I'll take the Bible as the true science. Well, the New Atheists reject the Bible as true science, but they still have, as an assumption of their whole enterprise, an anticipation that if this literature, if religion, is to have any substance to it at all, as Harris puts it, it should be telling us something about the chemical table, the structure of DNA, the age of the universe. But you Christians, you don't have that in the Bible, so why are you paying any attention to this? And this goes back to what I said earlier. The fundamental assumption underlying it is scientism. And scientism says take nothing on faith, but yet it takes enormous faith to embrace scientism. So there's a kind of self-subversion intellectually that's going on at the very foundation of all the new atheism that I've read. And it's just, frankly, not intellectually respectable, let alone religiously respectable.
I have a symbolic way of reflecting that same comment. I put the creationists, the idea movement people, and the new atheists all on the same bookshelf together.
Yeah.